I do apologize. I think they're having some technical issues. They're trying to sort it out. But again, I see Dr. Fergus there. So let me
Yes, I'm here, Ruskin.
good evening and welcome once again to Talk City 91.1 FM.
Yes, good evening and thank you, my brother Ruskin, and welcome to all our viewers and listeners to Indaba, the program where knowledge grows. Welcome wherever you are on Talk City 91.1 FM and on the TTESC's Facebook and YouTube channels. Welcome to another edition of Indaba. We have just one issue that we are going to engage in this edition, and that is, in a way, confronting the ghosts of chattel slavery in Trinidad and Tobago. We are going to talk about some of the biggest names in business, that is, the mercantile business in Trinidad and Tobago, the conglomerates, the clergy. We are going to restrict the discussion to Trinidad, and we are going to talk about Tobago at another time. I need to say that the objective is not to embarrass persons who, for one reason or the other, bear these surnames, but it is time for us to awaken the conscience of the heirs of the wealth of chattel slavery in Trinidad and Tobago, who continue to benefit, now living in several parts of the world, but also right here in this country. Now, as I mentioned at the launch of the Second International Decade for People of African Descent, heirs of slavery in some CARICOM countries have identified themselves. Some of them, of course, were forced to do so, but they have offered apologies and what I call tokens, because we cannot rightly consider what they offered to be reparations. I call them tokens of regret. We have in Guyana, for example, the Gladstones, one of the most famous political names in Britain. We have the Trevelyan's emerging in Grenada, the Draxes in Barbados, and of course in a number of other places. But when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago, there's silence, dead silence. But we have to say no more of that. The reckoning is here. The pursuit of reparatory justice includes a reckoning with these heirs of slavery, chattel slavery, and we're talking about enslavement of African peoples here, not forgetting that the indigenous peoples were also enslaved. Now, Trinidad, as most people would have been aware, entered into an agricultural revolution from the 1780s, that is the plantation revolution. And that was based on the cedula. A number of French people came in mainly from Grenada, so there are lots of French names. And of course, the British entered in 1797. But by 1834, most of the names of the people involved in the enslavement of African people were English. They were English because the French owners, most of them had gone into bankruptcy and had to sell their estates or mortgage those estates to English people. So we don't see them. Most of the names are not, they do not appear in the slave compensation list. But that does not mean to say that the French people were not heavily involved in the enslavement of Africans. But some names, of course, some of the big names, surprisingly, some of them at the top hierarchy of the church in Trinidad, their names are also mentioned. Now, let me give you a general overview of what happened at the dawn of the apprenticeship. That is, immediately after the 1st of August, 1834, there was a kind of a feeding frenzy to collect money because the Emancipation Act was essentially about the distribution of compensation money and how they could continue control over the Africans. Most people might be surprised. And most of the money is paid out. You know, the 15 million plus pounds that went to Caribbean enslavers already paid out by 1838. So before full emancipation came, these people had already collected cash, I'm talking about, because the apprenticeship was another form of compensation that was valued over 27 million pounds as well. So in Trinidad, the owners of enslaved Africans, that is those who laid a claim to African bodies, received 973,000 pounds sterling. More than that, I'm just rounding off. And they would have numbered 2,356 claimants. A number of them were claiming one enslaved person, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. The vast majority were claiming under 50. There were a few mega planters, but not as many as in Tobago. Now, at today's value, that would be worth over 156 million pounds. And I did a reduction to Trinidad and Tobago dollars, which would make more sense to some people. And that would be equivalent to $1,500,000,000. That is the equivalent at today's value. Although we are not dealing with Tobago, let me give you a synopsis of Tobago. Tobago cashed in 372 persons cashed in a total of 226,700 pounds, which at today's value would be equivalent to over 36 million pounds. And in TT dollars, 341 million pounds. Altogether, Trinidad and Tobago claimants collected over 1 billion, in fact, at today's value, almost $2 billion. Almost $2 billion. When you put Trinidad and Tobago together, almost $2 billion. Now, what did they do with that money? Some of them invested in business other than the business for which they claimed. Some of them continued into agriculture, but went into cocoa, new agricultural activities. Cocoa was making a lot of money, much more money than sugar in the Caribbean after slavery. So a number of them went into business, some went into real estate, and so on. Their names keep popping up throughout the 19th century. And let me also mention that at the point of collection, when they were collecting, now one of the things that I was not certain about, and which I never saw any explanation for, but how these people who owned one enslaved African too, how did they collect the money? Obviously, it would have made no sense going to England to collect the money. But that's another feature of this greed and this frenzy that was taking place. A commission was set up in each colony to appraise the value of Africans. And some of the biggest enslavers of Africans were the commissioners on those committees, and they also got paid for that. So in addition to claiming for Africans, they received monies for that as well. In addition, a few Trinidadian planters, including Marriott, and I'll call just two names for you, and Burnley, they went to England to act as agents for a number of the planters and owners who could not go to collect for themselves. And they collected fees for doing so, a significantly high percentage of the fees. So the names we see collecting a certain number of certain amount of monies for the Africans they own, you need to add to that all these other fees that they collected as well. So let me call some names here before before they allow the co-hosts and our special guests in view before they introduce them to you. We have names like Devotai, devotile, names like Huggins, names like Massey, names like Pantin. Let me give you some details. Of course, devotile and Pantin were high up in the church hierarchy in Trinidad. So that's the clergy I am talking about. Pantin, of course, one of the Pantins would have become Archbishop of Trinidad and Tobago. The name devotile appears at the dawn of British occupation of Trinidad in 1797. He came in, Chevalier de Devotile, he came in with Ralph Abercrombie and received land grants. He would have claimed 1,310 pounds, which in today's value would be over 9 million pounds, over 2 million pounds, $2 million, Trinidad dollars. We have Burnley. Burnley was one of the mega planters in Trinidad, claiming for over 1,000 African persons. And his total collection in terms of his own estate would have been over 2 million pounds, which would be equivalent today to almost $12 million. Now, Burnley is linked to a family called the Eccles, and together their collection would be over 30 million Trinidad dollars. They intermarried. For example, Burnley's son was married to an Eccles woman, and so on. So that wealth was tied together. People who live in South and Rio Claro would know the name Ecclesville. That is a legacy of that particular individual. The name Huggins come in as well. In the name of Horatio Nelson Huggins. The Huggins also had property in St. Vincent, and some of them were moving between Trinidad and St. Vincent. We have Massey. Massey, whose name is well known across the Caribbean as the Massey conglomerate, mainly in the supermarket business. And we have the name William Massey appearing with his wife, Sophie Massey, and collecting in Trinidad money over $2 million. I mentioned the Marriotts. They were mega owners of enslaved Africans, owning over 345 persons, and they would have collected over 34,000 pounds. And I said they were acting as agents. We have Louis Pantin. Louis Pantin, who was an ancestor to the modern-day Pantins in Trinidad. Again, the Pantins would be very significant in the Catholic Church and in the education system as well. So we have Louis Pantin and his wife, Rose Henriette Pantin, who collected over 10 million TT dollars by 1838. So those are some of the names that we have. We can name a lot more because the names are available in official documents. There are two main sources in case persons are interested in following up, doing their own research, seeing perhaps if a name that you carry now might feature in the lists. There's a list that was compiled in 1838, but there are supplementary claims that continued up to 1843. So you would not find every single claim in that list, but that is the official list compiled by the British Parliament. So you can Google that list of compensation list, and you should come up with it. And then there is the official slave compensation website that is managed, I think, by London University. Now, the names that are not on that list, if you Googled it, you would come up with the names on the official database. So you need to work with both of them. with both of them. In the case of the list, you can just scroll through the different colonies. So you have Trinidad separate, Tobago separate. The slave database, the compensation database is differently structured. You have to know who you're looking for. And you Google and they'll give you a lot more information than the list, because you would get the names of the estates, you would get relatives and a number of other important pieces of information. If names were changed over time, they indicate that these people were known by these two different names and so on. So let us introduce our guest and our co-host, Brother Shabaka Kambon. So Renee, you can bring them forth. And of course, Brother Shabaka needs no introduction, of course. He is a stalwart on Indaba. In fact, I owe him so much in a way, bringing me into the program on a regular basis. We had a lot of good times in studio. Now,
indeed,
and Dr. Tyehimba, let me just introduce Dr. Tyehimba for you, even though he has been here so often. He's a sociology lecturer at the University of the West Indies. His research interests include mental health, alternative education models, decoloniality, inequality, working class movement, sustainable development, and the diverse cultures that make up the Caribbean. He lectures in courses such as social change and development, the sociology of education, Caribbean social problems, and Caribbean social structure. Welcome, my younger brother. Welcome back to Indaba. So we are going to discuss the slave-owning families. Some of them I've mentioned already. If you think you want to find out about a particular name, you can ask. And of course, the value and the compensation. We want to look now at the moral responsibility of the heirs, that is these people, some of them that I mentioned, about the businesses and institutions around. Do they have a moral responsibility to the cause of reparatory justice that African peoples are seeking? That is a big question this evening. So let me, as usual, ask Brother Shabaka to make some introductory remarks before we bring in Brother Tyehimba. Yes, Shabaka.
Yes, greetings, Doctor. So there are a number of things that you have already raised here that are going to make for interesting conversation. One, the question of the clergy links. I think people would want to know more about that. And I think you already raised the question that you suggested that some of these families intermarried. And one of the families I'm going to be keen to find out about is the Beggarats and the Divertiles. Perhaps that's we see the Burnleys and the Eccles. It'd be interesting to see to clarify the Beggarats and the Divertiles. So these are fascinating questions. And the other question, I think, with the changing moral landscape in the world, I remember when Laura came, that would have been 2023, February 27th, when she came with her family to Grenada. That's the Trevelyan family. 104 of them signed the letter of apology to the Grenadian people. She said, she and her family said openly that there were a number of other prominent formerly slave-owning families that were keen to come forward. You wonder why you can't get a peep out of the Trinidadian society. I'm curious if Dr. Salandy has any answers to that question, which of course you raised, Dr. Fergus. So this is let's get into it, gentlemen.
Yes. So Dr. Salandy, welcome to the program. Your opening remarks.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for both your introductions. Dr. Fergus. What you presented aligns with what I've seen in some of the historical archives, particularly in terms of some of the names associated with certain plantations. Now, where I'm from in Diego Martin, there's a large area of land um, which is associated to the Fuller family, which also goes back to the period of enslavement. So
Yes,
all
Henry Fuller
around
is the
Trinidad,
main man's name. Henry Fuller.
correct.
Yes, yes.
Correct. So all around Trinidad, we do have these histories where it isn't just the payout, but some of the initial access to huge hundreds of acres of land still form part of the inequality in terms of access to land and resources that we have today. And just to add a side note to your point about apprenticeship, I don't know if we realize the atrocity that happened with the whole apprenticeship period. So it's almost as if you have a car worth $10,000 and somebody hits it and only wants to pay you $1,000. So no person in their right mind would accept that. And so, in the context of the end of enslavement, where you had Africans being viewed as commodities with a monetary price attached to them, the compensation that they received in terms of millions of pounds were less than they were actually worth on the market. And so, to compensate for that, they came up with the scheme of apprenticeship. And if we understand the heights of that, where enslaved Africans were made to pay for their own selves. And so it wasn't just the actual compensation that we have to think about, but also the value of the apprenticeship period in terms of the labor given to meet the shortfall in terms of the value of enslaved Africans. And so you have a whole set of ongoing injustices from pre-emancipation to post-emancipation that has to be a central part of the dialogue around reparations.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And perhaps you can comment on the sort of a corollary to that, in that, in addition to all of these assets that the planters were, well, not only planters, but the mortgagees and all of them were allowed to walk away with after emancipation, including their lands, that the policy against African people was to ensure they had no access to land by the state, the government that is, allowing lands to be sold. The smallest block must be 1 square mile. So if you couldn't afford that, then you couldn't buy. And the planters would have collaborated not to sell land to the African people, particularly the newly freed people. And in addition to that, the government issued instructions to destroy all the crops and animals of the enslaved people, even during the apprenticeship itself, so that they were emerging from slavery, in some instances worse, economically worse than during the slavery period. You know, could you comment on that?
It's quite ironic that people were actually granted land based upon the number of slaves that you had. So the more slaves you had, you were granted, additional acres of land. So it is really an important point to understand that it wasn't just the compensation that was the injustice, but a whole set of intersecting issues, starting with the original grants of the land, that in which persons were given more according to the slaves they had. And then we also had the post-emancipation period, where you had this emerging agricultural-based peasantry throughout the entire Caribbean. And you had a number of laws, as you mentioned, that was there to stymie the growth of this peasantry. So we're talking about anti-squatting laws and anti-vagrancy laws. We're talking about land laws that barred land from being sold under a certain acreage. So you have a whole set of intersecting mechanisms from laws and and policies that was aimed at sort of closing down the emerging class of persons coming out of the post-emancipation period.
Yeah, and wherever the Africans successfully circumvented those obstructions, like in Guyana, where they formed cooperatives to purchase estates, shortly after the government stepped in to ban the breaking up of estates. So once you bought them, you could not break them up into separate, farms and so on. So whatever they attempted to do, they were frustrated. And I want to mention one more thing before Shabaka jumps in. And it was not that some of the leading elements in the British Parliament didn't recognize that Africans needed compensation, right? And people who were major sources of information for those parliamentarians. For example, Thomas Clarkson said very clearly that we owe the Africans compensation for the crimes we have committed against them for centuries. He said that. And Thomas Buxton, who was leading the abolitionist movement in the parliament, and by the way, who was responsible for the setting up of these police stations and so on, because he said he would not agree to emancipation until they put police measures in place to contain the men, the people who were to be free. But he said, since 1823, the people who really should be paid compensation were the enslaved people, not the planters. He did a double take, on the question of compensation when the debate on the Emancipation Act came about, where now he fully supported emancipation for the planters and said that for the enslaved people, they would be given compensation by way of Bibles. He said it is the only compensation we owe them, Bibles. So the point I want to make is this. So that whereas Africans were expecting some kind of compensation, or at least being allowed to engage in their own economic activities and so on, what was launched against them was a new kind of enslavement, intellectual, psychological enslavement, symbolized by the Bible. I'm not condemning the Bible, but I see it as a kind of a metaphor for the enslavement, the intellectual enslavement of Africans, because that was the only way they could control them, and they said so. So the education system combined with Christianization were the two main institutions or agencies through which they intended to control Africans after emancipation. Yes, Shabaka.
Yeah, Dr. Fergus, just to clarify, who was it? Was it Buxton that said that they should be given Bibles as compensation?
Yes, Buxton is the man.
Buxton is the man. Wow, what a revelation to me tonight. You always learn something new here on Indaba. It's a place where knowledge grows. Let me just add a quick piece to the conversation, gentlemen. Otoba Kuguano, known European name John Stewart. In the 1790s, he published a book. I don't remember the name of it now, but in that
1780s, Shabaka. 1780s.
1780s.
Yeah.
Remember the name of his book, Dr. Fergus?
It's the Otoba Kuguano.
Yes.
Okay, it's
While Dr. Fergus,
I think it's the narratives of I'll give you in a short while. Go ahead.
In the 1780s, said
1780s, yes.
In his book in the
1780s, Equiano, Kuguano, and 10 other Africans who we can consider the first Pan-Africanists in England. They formed this society called the Sons of Africa. And that in fact, was an anti-slave trade, anti-slavery society before the British, before the white British.
Yeah, and I raise this issue because Cugoano, as you talk about Thomas Clarkson and others saying that Africans they were owed compensation for enslavement. Cugoano said the same thing in the 1780s, long before any of them did. He said that it was just for reparations to be paid, along with a number of other revolutionary things. He also said that slavery is a crime of the first magnitude, and those who traffic and enslave other human beings, it matters not what they do, because none of their other virtues are worth a straw. Once you engage in that form of evil, he said, you had to be, you had to be seen in that light. And I think Cugoano also suggests in the book that there should be days and festivals put aside to commemorate what had happened to Africans at the end of the period. So I think I just wanted to mention that, and also point out that the circumstances that both you and Dr. Salandy talk about, Dr. Fergus, and I want to get your opinion on this. A lot of the academics are now using the term apartheid to describe that which entailed in the period after apprenticeship, after emancipation for African people, and the circumstances you all talk about here, the efforts to try to stop Africans from owning land and cultivating land, the efforts to try to stop them from to the vagrancy laws, all the different things that were put in place to ensure that they stayed at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. That, to me, it clearly speaks to a situation of apartheid. Do you gentlemen agree with that particular terminology being used here?
I think it's appropriate. In fact, I think if Zakia were with us, she would tell you about her latest experience in the Turks and Caicos Islands. That is just over the weekend, where she came face to face with apartheid, live and direct. So we are very much living in an apartheid system in the Caribbean still. It's much more intense and overt in some places, more brazen, but it's not absent from Trinidad and Tobago. But I would let the sociologist comment on that.
Yes, well, I actually find that this post-emancipation period doesn't get enough attention in terms of how understanding how foundational that whole period was in terms of elite interests losing the type of control they had during enslavement, and trying to find new ways of control and domination, and trying to configure the society in their interests. And today, in terms of a lot of the issues and problems we have, if we go to the root of it, it goes back to that foundation. So we're talking about the types of education structures and systems that have been in place, the types of laws, the plantation types of institutions, and even our present constitution, given that we have as part of that what is called the savings clause, in which we are unable to change colonial era British laws. So we have so much from that post-emancipation period that still remains inhibiting progress and inhibiting the pathways to justice that many would see today.
I have another question, gentlemen. I looked at in the 1820s, we observed Trinidadian enslavers organizing themselves into a pro-slavery society to stave off emancipation, which seemed to be in the cards at that point. Is that a factor? The fact that they seem to be more extreme in their pro-slavery views at that point in time. Is that a factor in the silence in this particular period where people are coming forward and apologizing and trying to make amends and so on. Is that a factor? This posture that they took towards emancipation in the very first place, is that a factor you see still sort of a legacy that you still see in the Trinidadian plantocracy today?
Well, when you say the Trinidad plantocracy today, you need to clarify a little bit.
The inheritors of the Trinidadian plantocracy. Is it that tradition? Is it that they're influenced by that tradition coming out of the 1820s, that pro-slavery society, when the Europe and the metropoles were coming to a point where there was a moral discourse taking place alongside the economic one, and they were moving towards some kind of amelioration and freedom. The plantocracy here in the Caribbean, and Trinidad in particular, seem to be heading in the opposite direction.
Yes, indeed. I agree with the premise. I agree with your premise. But we have a voice note that a listener has sent in, and we would ask Renee to play it so that we can respond to it. So as soon as you're ready, Renee, you can play that voice note for us.
Right. Now
So, but in the meantime,
names of families that benefited from the compensation given to owners of enslaved persons following emancipation, how should the society now respond? What should we expect of them? What should we be asking of them at this time, since descendants of those families are still among us and are still prospering in the society? Good night. Now that we have
good night. Thank you very much for that intervention. It's an excellent question. And of course, it puts into context all that we are talking about. So how should we respond? And how should the heirs respond to the issue of reparatory justice? I think, for one thing, we need to make them conscious of the past crimes that their ancestors would have committed. We have to make that known to them, and for them to at least embrace that past, not to love it, to condemn it, yes, but they have to own it. Just as the Trevelyan's would have owned up, just as the Gladstones would have owned up. We know a lot of people have been exposed but would not own up as well. And a famous case is the Draxes of Barbados, one of the descendants being a parliamentarian in the British Parliament at the moment. And he thinks the past is a past. Forget the past. So he does not believe he owes even an apology. So the awakening is one thing, but the embracing of that past as a crime that they are beneficiaries of even today, I think this is the struggle we have, in a sense, in exposing this kind of information. I think that's one of the objectives, at least from my point of view, that we need to awaken the consciences of these people. But first of all, they need to know and they need to embrace that knowledge as well, own up to it. So that's my position on that. And of course, I'm sure you have your own positions on this matter.
To both of you on relation to the same question. Let's go deeper, gentlemen, because I look back at the period of 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, and I remember we interviewed a lady from Wales. She was in charge of the Welsh response to Black Lives Matter, the removal of certain monuments to Governor Picton, who was the first British governor of Trinidad and Tobago. And their removal of monuments to Picton was accompanied by an entire investigation into their education system, the content of their curricula, how they could reform those things so that they could undermine the legacy of people like Governor Picton, of that system in which people like Governor Picton flourished back in the 19th century. But here in the Caribbean, No such reckoning has taken place, certainly not in Trinidad and Tobago. And as a person who regularly teaches history to young, first, second, and third form, and fourth, fifth form young people in this country, I could tell you that teachers are sending children home, with exercises to talk about the benefits, the pros and cons of slavery, to talk about the benefits of the Columbian exchange, during the period of the high point of genocide, in the early years of after Columbus's invasion and occupation of the Caribbean. There is no genuine, according to Dr. Tony Martin, he said it before he passed away, the real horrors of enslavement simply are not addressed in our curriculum. And so not just white Trinidadians or people racialized as white, but those racialized as black, Africans, Indians, etc., all come out without a genuine sense of the true horrors that our ancestors experienced. And then perhaps you can't blame them for not thinking that it is important to address the issue. Well, what say you, gentlemen?
So if I can respond, so I think that you have a valid point, because I don't think that people realize that here in the Caribbean, we have had to endure the worst crimes against humanity ever recorded in human history. And I don't think that we have done a good job of coming to terms with that and addressing the trauma and the points of silence that still exist today. And I would certainly encourage people to maybe think about using modern technology, maybe, a documentary or other types of film, as a way of investigating a lot of these issues, or maybe a way of transforming some of the academic work into mediums that may be more accessible to the current generations who are very technological. So there's a long way we have to go to tell our story. And part of the reason why it's a long journey is because the mainstream education system does a poor job of telling the whole of our story, especially from diverse points of view. So it's a case of swimming against the tide when we're talking about these issues, because the majority of people not concerned about addressing a lot of things that may come up.
And of course, when we look at the way that the history is treated, we applauded, rightfully so, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Rowley, for his strong position in terms of removing the coat of the 3 ships from the coat of arms. But the PNM government has done nothing to educate the population as to the importance of that transformation. And so you have the vast majority of people are neither here nor there. They think, oh, it's nice to see the pan. They do not understand that we have just removed symbols of genocide and colonial violence from our national thing, which of course brought shame on us as a people, because the authorities are just too lackadaisical about these things. And I think those things are connected. And I just want to share that there's a comment here from in our chat from a lecturer at the University of the West Indies. I wouldn't call his name, but he asks, he says there's a recent example of the government handing over a huge tract of land on the Orange Grove estate to the Massey Corporation to build a warehouse without paying any respect to what happened on that land. And he wonders if we have to do more to deal with these matters when we talk about handing over the people's resources, particularly resources that have that kind of historical legacy associated with them, to the heirs of enslavement, to the heirs of.
Right. Excellent. I want to commend that that person who made that intervention. And of course, that's so critical. Partly the reason is ignorance. And of course, the persons who engage in handing over that land, recommending handover, probably don't have a clue who Massey, the name Massey, really is, historically speaking. So that is one of the reasons I suspect. But the irony is that those plantations there were in the hands, a lot of them were owned by Burnley, and of course, Burnley would have also owned the Tacarigua estate. We know more about that one because of the savannah that is there, and perhaps because of Professor Kojo's work on William H. Burnley. But Professor Kojo did not go to the extent of identifying the heirs of the Burnleys up to this point, which would have helped us a lot in our discussion. But yes, that now that we know, I think it is incumbent on us to lodge a protest for the handing over of this. Because we who have the information, we also have the obligation to society to act on it and to put that to the best use. So if the government acts in ignorance and we are aware of the history behind that, then we need to at least protest and seek to make some kind of intervention. Another irony is that these estates were actually built by Africans, and there is this myth that Africans did not want to work after emancipation, so the indentured laborers would have been the ones that saved the plantations and also give the sense that those plantations were probably built by those indentured laborers. But if you look at the names of the estates at the point of emancipation, you would see that very little was added after emancipation. Very, very few were added at all. What they did was to expand the acreages under cultivation and so on. But it's African people who established those plantations. And when the last mega plantation was divided up, you know, Caroni 1975 Limited, what did Africans get? Nothing, virtually nothing, right? So that is one of the perhaps in a sense, it's another crime that was committed against African people, that the estates that they built, that they developed towards the wealth, not only of Trinidad, with limited in the discussion of Trinidad, but by extension to the British Empire as well. What did we get for it? Virtually nada, nothing, absolutely nothing. Okay.
That one of my students raised with me recently, and so I'm glad that you kind of touched on it there. This idea that a group saved the plantations, you know. How should we, when we're looking back at this period, you know, is that the language, is that the vocabulary, the appropriate vocabulary to use? You're talking about the institutions, you know, forced labor camps, saving the profitability of forced labor camps. Is that a good thing? What kind of vocabulary can we utilize you know, to deal with these things? Is this vocabulary we inherited? Is it something we should critique and interrogate? Is the question of development something we should critique and?
If the planters had wanted to pay Africans their due wages, they would have had no cause to bring in indentured laborers. One of the main reasons that indentured laborers were brought in was to depress wages. That is the main reason. And there was a principle called scientific colonization that was developed by a guy named Gibbon Wakefield in the 1830s for the colonization of Australia. And Burnley recommended that that policy be applied to Trinidad to prevent Africans from access to land. So that the double trajectory was that bringing people, which was an original recommendation by Burnley himself since 1815, to bring in laborers from India. That was Burnley's original idea since 1815, in order to ensure that Africans do not have the labor power to demand wages, and those wages were in fact worked out in Trinidad since the 1820s. Significant wages. The wages were worked out.
I agree with you fully on those things. The question I'm asking is, when we look back at this period, when is the profitability of the estates in our, when I say our, I'm talking about everybody across the board now in Trinidad and Tobago. Does that benefit us as a society? The profitability of these slave camps, forced labor camps, turned into indentureship labor camps, are the success of these labor camps in some way beneficial to us? Do we need to keep using, their success? Do we equate that with development?
No, I was coming to that, but I probably went along too far before I came around to it. But yes, I agree with you, because we have to decolonize even decolonization, as a scholar from South Africa said, right? The question of saving the plantation, that's the point I wanted to make, because you said that is a dominant narrative still in the school. It's a dominant narrative in the schools that indentured laborers came and saved the plantation. Of course, the other one was that Africans did not want to work. But between 1838 and 1845, when the first indentures came, the estates did not collapse. Who maintained estate production? If you look at production and the profitability of the estates even then, you would realize that is a myth. It's a myth that justified indentureship. But then the other part of your question is, of course, if that was a successful strategy, how did we benefit from it? We could not have benefited. It was one of the main props that were put in the way, obstacles in the way of African advancement and progress after emancipation. Indentureship was designed to ensure that Africans remain on the plantations or on the periphery of society as far as their economic advancement is concerned. But over to Tyehimba.
Well, I quite agree. And even if we look at all the major historical processes that we have learned about, whether it be emancipation, indentureship, independence, to me, all of these are very fraudulent, because there is a narrative about it that doesn't actually fit the reality. And so I think that there's so much myths that we have to combat in a pathway towards getting a better sense of the issues within Caribbean history. So I'm not a fan of the mainstream narrative of emancipation, and I think that there is a lot within the the emancipation to post-emancipation period that I think have important lessons for a lot of the issues that we're facing now with our young people, with mental health, with agriculture, with crime. So we do have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I would like you to comment as we come to the top of the hour. One of the precautions that the parliamentarians would have asked for, particularly Buxton, again, he was leading that, was the institutionalizing of police, the establishment of police. He said he would not agree to emancipation unless police measures were put in place. 1 month before emancipation, they divided Trinidad into 9 precincts, 9 police precincts. Each precinct was to have a police station, a jail, whether the jail was inside of the prison or next to it, and a court, which was always next to the prison. If you look at the old structures, the old warden system, you would see where you have a police station, you have a court, right? So that went hand in hand. The police system in Trinidad and Tobago, the structure, right, if you call it an infrastructure, is still 9 precincts. It's based on the same original 9 precincts, with Port of Spain being a separate one. Exactly the same thing that we have had in the preparation for emancipation, not at the dawn, but in preparation for emancipation. What does that tell us about the intention of those who were to bring chattel slavery to an end? Obviously, it was purely a matter of new strategies of control. New strategies of control. So the Emancipation Act itself was an act for the further control of the African people. Even, and I would end with this, even the Education Act stated clearly in black and white that the system must be such as to maintain effective control over the minds of the laboring classes so that it would fit them for the role as agriculture. So that the education of Africans, as I've said before, is during the course of the 19th century, if there was any education at all in terms of the rise of an educated middle class, it was in spite of the education system, not because of it. Over to you.
Yes, well, you are all correct. So I quite agree with you. I am especially concerned with the role of education and the role of mainstream religions in controlling the education system. And I know that we had, well, the Prime Minister had a recent meeting with religious leaders and all of that. And even today, we are still navigating this very toxic culture of prestige and non-prestige schools that go back to the Concordat Agreement, which goes even further to the dominance of these religious institutions in the education of Trinidadians and those from Tobago. So more than a century later, we are still grappling, struggling, suffering with the trauma coming out of the structures set in place years ago. And I think that we really need some more attention being placed on some of these issues, especially in terms of education, where I'm not convinced that the types of structures we have in terms of prestige and non-prestige are really doing justice in the ability to support and transform the potential of our young people. So our young people are hurting within these current educational models. And so the outside alternative, structures, there's really more room to develop those to combat what young people are experiencing in the mainstream one.
Gentlemen, let me just take us back to the issue here tonight. And let me point out that, and going back to Laura Trevelyan and her family, and of course, they would have received, about $3.5 million in today's currency for the just over 1,000 Africans that they had enslaved on over 6 plantations in Grenada. And of course, I agree with Dr. Fergus when he says that the monies that they, these former enslavers give out of their own pockets and so on, they can't be equated with reparations. But we have to admit that it was quite, it speaks to the changing moral landscape that Laura Trevelyan would take £100,000 out of her own pocket, her own pension from the BBC, and give it to the University of the West Indies as part of her, in conjunction with her apology, that she could dig that deep, to leave England and come to the Caribbean and dig deep like that in her own pocket to begin the discourse. And yet, no Trinidadian planter up to date has come forward even to apologize or to acknowledge their role in this history. I think that's where we are today. That's the reality of our situation. I put that the stark contrast between the Trevelyans and all those other families and institutions that have been coming forward recently, and the silence in Trinidad and Tobago.
You're right, and that is supplemented, Shabaka, by a near absence of what I call the torture technologies of slavery, the necklacing, the shackles and all these things. Do you ever see those things around, even in museums and so on? If you go to Barbados, the Barbados Museum is well supplied with those legacies, right? so that you walk into a museum in Trinidad and you may not see those things. Maybe one little piece here or there, but there's no collection as such that you can take school children to and say, look, this was what your ancestors suffered. And that you could probably have these things made public as well. So you confront people, the children of the heirs of these people are around. And because there is such a silence, they can remain quiet. Some of them, of course, don't know, like the Trevelyan's claim that they know, which we don't quite believe, of course. But there's another story, Shabaka, to the Trevelyan. That same Trevelyan, you wouldn't believe the things she left out. I am privy to that information because I'm involved in a book being written on it right now. Now. Some of our greatest ancestors that were involved in slave trading around the world, she left them out. And it couldn't be that she didn't know. She left them out. You see? But it is good that they are coming out because we need them to acknowledge the past. We need them to acknowledge the past because in doing so, my belief is that those who acknowledge are not going to be the ones also pushing back against the reparatory movement. So it would be like you're removing some of the pushback obstacles that we know are in the way now. And some of them are in fact formidable. If you have a voice like Massey coming forward, well, I don't think, I've tried to find out, perhaps that's where we need more research, whether there's any Massey descendant working on Massey. That I don't know. But of course, when the company was founded, there were Masseys that can trace their ancestry back into slavery. But when you look at the CEOs and the managers and all these people, I don't see any Massey names. But it doesn't mean Masseys are not there, because as we said earlier, a number of them intermarried into different families and so on. Well, but they need to come forward, and this is what we are hoping that in discussions like these, which I hope would not end with this evening's program, that we continue that kind of discussion. Somebody's going to pick it up. Some of the perhaps media houses going to pick it up. And then that is how we are going to have some effect on the consciences of these people.
Well, Doc, I'm going to put you in touch with a researcher who says that she has discovered the 12 different families that would be the descendants of the Masseys, the descendants of that fortune. The 12.
Great, yeah. I'd love to see that.
We'll talk about that later. But yeah, what a thing with the Trevelyan's and more bacchanal to come. But you know, I think
yes, and it could be before the end of the year. You never know.
Yeah, well, I think they've made a principal stand, and they have actually made overtures to the monarchy in the United Kingdom to support to work with the Caribbean people, the Caribbean Reparations Commission going forward. So they are making that kind
That's
of.
That's something we need to be aware of. Beware of the people who oppressed you becoming your allies. You always have to be careful of them wanting to change the narrative, soften the objectives, and so on. So yes, they are welcome to assist in certain ways, but you've got to be careful. You've got to be always aware that they may be coming in, and I mean, there are so many precedents for that. Infiltrate in a sense, right? All that is infiltration. They may be doing it openly. Some do it, you know, secretly. But it is infiltration, and once they infiltrate, they want to change the narrative. They want to change the objectives and so on, soften things.
Doc,
so you got to be beware as well.
Let's just be clear in terms of where we are as a people. You know, I mean, it'd be hard to soften our objectives.
Don't say that, Shabaka. There are certain things I can't say on air, but I'm telling you that is an objective that I'm telling you is having effect even now.
Yeah, but for the last 3 years, I have been asking audiences across the country repeatedly to tell me if they have ever seen or they could point me in the direction of an institution or place where we could find one implement of violence related to slavery or or the trafficking of our African ancestors. And nobody, nowhere could direct me to those things. In fact, most times you go to a school, not even the teachers can name 2 slave masters. Not even the history teacher could name 2 slave masters. That's where we are right now. And in fact, just to be honest, to be 100% honest, until you and I, Dr. Fergus, stop the people at Lopino, we removed that sign up at Lopino, the only properly constituted space in the country to teach our people about the period of enslavement, actually celebrated the slave master and his wife as illustrious and invited people to go and pay homage to them at their raised graves. That's where we are. So I just want to, so sometimes when we talk about, our agenda, we are so backward. And I think we have to be honest about our backwardness and the role that we post-independence people, not you and me and Dr. Tyehimba, but the ones who are in power are playing in prolonging the status quo and propping up the status quo and undermining all efforts to change things around here.
We have made a lot of strides and we need to recognize that. So before we do the closing remarks, let me just tell you that I actually have Kogwano's book on my computer as a digital book. And the title is Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery. It's a long title, very, very long. Those books in those days had extremely long titles. So long, would take up several lines and still they would end up with ESC and so on and so on, right? So I have the book in front of me, actually. It was a book I had difficulty getting, so I had to read a lot of that information from other sources, but I have the book. I have Equiano's book. I try collecting these things, so I keep searching the internet for these things all the time to see what downloadable copies I can get. So I do have that book. So I think we can wrap up this evening's discussion, and we'll give Dr. Tyehimba the first go and make a final comments, but you can respond to Shabaka's questions and suggestions as well.
Yeah, so much to say.
What's that?
I say you can call them questions and provocations.
I
don't think that our local elite are really ready to own up to their privilege and their entanglements with our history. And so it really calls for people to be more informed. And it really calls for a new set of way to represent and narrate a better sense of history. So I would like to see some documentaries, some more progressive type documentaries coming out that is really able to capture the history in a way that sort of brings it, to life. I also just want to reiterate that reparations is not only about the past, but there is a lot of ongoing things that we have to pay attention to. And I think that if we look around at the current elections, that also is a reminder of the need to reform our constitution, because what we have inherited as this Westminster system in which power is concentrated between 2 main political parties, that affects the way that people vote in very racialized ways. All of these things are not working for the good of the country. So whether it be historical wrongs or present day ongoing wrongs, I think that we have a lot to do to bring about redress to all of the ongoing trauma that we could see around the country.
Yes, so let me end with these remarks. With this remark, actually, just one more. Shabaka, I want you to respond to what I'm saying. That's why I'm going first, before you. I'm going before you. Right, so this discussion this evening, I think, as I said earlier, I hope it's an inaugural discussion and that we continue to address these issues. These are fundamental issues as we develop as a nation and as we seek reparatory justice. Now, I am suggesting, and Shabaka, you can respond because you are the leader of one of these NGOs. I'm suggesting that we can issue a joint statement, the ESC, the Freedom Project, and the National Committee on Reparations, that we get together and issue a joint statement on the land allocation, either already distributed or promised to Massey, and outline in that statement why we object to these sort of distributions of land, and that perhaps government efforts should be redirected to allocating land to people of African descent, who many of whom their ancestors would have worked on those very said estates. So I am suggesting that we put out a joint statement, and not some time in the distant future, but that we get together soon to draft a joint statement to confront this decision of the government to allocate the lands to Massey.
I think that's definitely something that we should look at very carefully, and I'm sure when we put our minds together, there'll be a number of different issues that will come up in relation to this. So certainly I would be interested in having that conversation. But Dr. Fergus, before we close tonight, it would be remiss of me and all of us not to thank you profusely and to congratulate you for having the moral courage to use the stage that was given to you at the launch of the second International Decade for People of African Descent, the second United Nations Decade, to begin to call the names and speak to the issue right here in Trinidad and Tobago. That takes, a lot of people who've talked about it in hushed tones behind the scenes for some time now. But you have stepped forward and begun the discourse, and we must thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my brother. So with that, we bring the curtains down on this evening's program. We say good night to our listeners on the different media platforms. 91.1, if you haven't left us yet, thank you for tuning in. Facebook and YouTube viewers, thank you for joining us. See you again next week, same time, and on the same platforms for another edition of Indaba, the program where knowledge grows, and the Africa Report will be back next week. Thank you and good night.